For the first time in the history of this investigation, Marty Lagina pointed to an exact location and made a remarkably specific statement. The evidence indicates that something is there. Not an approximate zone, not a probable area, but a precise location supported by data detailed enough to make that conclusion credible. This is the moment that makes this episode of The Curse of Oak Island such a shocker. In this episode, Marty Lagina finally identifies the exact location that the evidence from this season appears to be pointing toward. What data allowed him to become this specific? Why did this particular finding matter to him? And what could it mean for the investigation from this point forward? Those are the questions this video will explore from beginning to end. But before getting to the location itself, there are 3 important things viewers need to understand. Who Marty Lagina is, what the investigation has been working toward all these years, and what this season's evidence finally revealed. Without that context, Marty's statement could seem like just another dramatic television moment. With that context, it becomes something much more significant. Marty Lagina's history on this investigation has been defined by restraint. That is not a criticism. In fact, it is one of the reasons the investigation has maintained its credibility. Marty is an engineer by training, and his professional background is centered on measuring evidence, assessing risk carefully, and making sure that a conclusion never goes further than the data can support. Throughout the series, Marty has often been the person saying, "Not yet." Whenever the team became excited about a discovery, he was usually the one asking what other explanations might exist. When the investigation appeared ready to settle on a particular conclusion, Marty would ask for the evidence that could eliminate the simpler possibilities. That history is exactly what makes his statement in this episode so important. Rick Lagina, Marty's brother, has generally approached the investigation from a very different starting point. His belief in the mystery of Oak Island has remained strong, even when the available evidence was not yet enough to provide a definitive answer. After more than 13 seasons of watching the brothers work together, viewers have seen this contrast clearly. Marty approaches the mystery through evidence and measurement, while Rick often approaches it through possibility and belief. In this episode, however, that difference begins to converge, and the resolution comes from Marty's direction. At its core, the Oak Island investigation has never simply been about proving one particular theory. It has been about following the consistent clues contained within the physical evidence that investigators have accumulated over centuries. The story began in 1795, when the first known investigation of the island started. Since then, numerous teams have returned to Oak Island with increasingly advanced equipment, only to encounter obstacles that repeatedly stopped their progress. Deep underground structures, ground collapses, and the island's engineered flood systems have turned promising excavations into frustrating failures. Among the most important discoveries have been signs of deliberate construction at significant depths. Wooden platforms were reportedly found at regular intervals as excavation continued downward, beginning with the discoveries associated with Daniel McInnes and followed by investigations conducted over more than 2 centuries. There is also the evidence of a flood tunnel system, consisting of artificial channels that appear to connect specific areas of the island with the surrounding ocean. These channels have been interpreted as an engineered system capable of allowing seawater to enter the primary excavation area when digging reached certain depths. If that interpretation is correct, the engineering involved would have required considerable knowledge of tidal movement, construction techniques, and the island's natural geography. It would also suggest that someone deliberately designed the underground system to make access to a particular area extremely difficult. Over the course of the television investigation, researchers have also recovered materials from different locations and seasons that have generated questions about activity on the island, occurring long before the period traditionally associated with European settlement in the region. Piece by piece, these discoveries have contributed to a larger structural picture. The possibility of a carefully constructed underground system created by skilled people for a specific purpose. And now, Marty has pointed toward the location that may represent the center of that system. The search for that center goes all the way back to the beginning. In 1795, the first investigation began, and for more than 2 centuries, researchers have attempted to determine what lies beneath Oak Island. Every generation has brought better equipment and new theories, yet the same fundamental problem remained: getting through the island's underground defenses. What changed during the years of the television investigation was the quality and quantity of the data available to the team. Radar surveys, core sampling, soil analysis, geological studies, and archival research spanning multiple countries and centuries gradually began creating a more detailed picture of what lies beneath the island. Instead of simply identifying suspicious areas, the investigators could begin comparing different underground features and determining how they might relate to one another. The picture became increasingly detailed. It became more coherent, and, most importantly, it began pointing toward a particular section of the island. This season was the point when that developing picture became specific enough for Marty to identify an exact location. The evidence did not arrive in one dramatic discovery. As has often happened during the Oak Island investigation, it developed gradually over the course of multiple episodes. Each new piece of information added another layer to a picture that was already taking shape. Radar scans conducted over specific areas revealed structural profiles at depth that appeared different from what would normally be expected in undisturbed natural ground. Some of these profiles showed defined edges and a degree of geometric regularity that could be interpreted as signs of constructed features rather than naturally occurring geological formations. Then came the core samples from locations that had been flagged as potentially significant. The soil composition results from these samples also raised questions because they appeared inconsistent with what would normally be expected from natural deposition. Together, these findings added another level of detail to the investigation. The significance was not simply that the team had discovered something unusual underground. The bigger development was that multiple types of evidence were beginning to point toward the same area. And that is what makes Marty's decision to identify a specific location so important. For someone who has spent years demanding stronger evidence before accepting a conclusion, pointing to one precise area represents a major step. The question now is whether the evidence is strong enough to finally tell the team where the most important target on Oak Island may actually be, and whether that location could change the direction of the entire investigation. Directional analysis of underground passages and corridors, confirmed in earlier seasons, produced lines that extended across the island's underground map and gradually pointed toward a specific area where multiple paths appeared to converge. The zone became narrower with every new piece of information. Each data point added another level of precision. By the time this episode arrived, the evidence was no longer pointing toward a broad region. It was pointing toward a specific location. That location already had documented significance within the investigation. It sits in a particular relationship to the money pit, the swamp, and the flood tunnel corridors that the team has been mapping and studying over multiple seasons. Earlier seasons had already produced findings in and around this area. There were anomalies, structural indicators, and core sample results that were significant enough to be flagged and documented, but they had never been specific enough to identify the area as a definitive target. The flood tunnel network adds another important piece to the picture. When the distribution of these underground structures is compared with the island's overall underground geography, a high concentration of defensive features appears around the same area Marty eventually identified. That pattern itself provides another clue about where the most heavily protected feature of the system could be located. Time and again, previous investigations approached this area using different methods and from different directions. The results were consistently interesting, but they never reached the point of being definitive. This season, that changed. The specific evidence behind Marty's location claim can be traced back to several different findings. Radar scans over the identified area produced structural profiles at a consistent depth. These profiles showed characteristics that appeared more consistent with a constructed underground feature than with a naturally occurring geological formation. Core samples taken from within the same zone provided another important piece of evidence. The material found at that depth showed characteristics that did not appear consistent with ordinary natural deposition. Then there were the directional lines drawn from confirmed underground features elsewhere on the island. When those lines were extended toward their logical points of convergence, they intersected at the same location. Not approximately near the location. At the location. Marty brought these separate pieces of information together. He followed the evidence to the point where everything appeared to converge, and then he said what that convergence led him to conclude. He delivered the statement in the same way he has approached important findings throughout the investigation. Directly, calmly, and without giving the evidence more weight than it deserved. It was not presented as a dramatic announcement or a moment created simply for television. It was a conclusion supported by data that viewers could trace back through the investigation. Marty identified the location, explained the evidence that had led him there, and delivered his assessment with the measured confidence that has become one of his defining characteristics throughout more than a decade on the show. For the first time in the history of this investigation, Marty Lagina was not simply saying that an area was interesting or worth investigating. He was identifying where he believed the evidence was leading. That is what made the moment so meaningful. Rick's reaction made the significance even clearer. When he heard what Marty had said, he became noticeably still. Rick has believed for years that Oak Island holds an important secret. His belief in the mystery has never depended entirely on having definitive proof. But there is something different about hearing the person who has consistently demanded evidence before accepting a conclusion finally say that the evidence has reached this level. Rick looked at the same information Marty had just presented and saw something he had carried with him for years, not necessarily a brand new discovery, but a form of confirmation. His reaction was not an immediate celebration. That would not have matched the moment. Instead, he stood there and allowed the significance of what had just been presented to sink in. After years of searching, years of uncertainty, and years of waiting for the evidence to become strong enough, the moment had finally taken on a different meaning. The wider team's response added another layer to the moment. The analysts, specialists, consultants, and long-term investigators who had been working alongside the Lagina brothers throughout the season also heard the specific location claim and understood its importance. These were experienced professionals who had spent years studying Oak Island and examining the same types of evidence. When Marty made such a precise statement, they understood exactly why it mattered. The atmosphere became noticeably quieter. The expressions on the faces of the people in the room reflected the significance of what they had just heard. It did not feel like a reaction to something they had simply been told to consider important. They understood the conclusion because they had been working with the same evidence. They had been following the same clues, and when Marty finally named the location where those clues appeared to converge, they recognized the significance of the moment immediately. What the identified location reveals about the design of the underground system is the next important analytical question. If the location Marty identified is the system's primary protected zone, and the directional convergence in the data supports that possibility, then the distribution of the flood tunnel network begins to make sense in a different way. The channels that have stopped excavation attempts whenever teams reached certain depths may have been positioned specifically to protect this particular area. When the Smith's Cove drainage system, the passages confirmed in earlier seasons, and the directional geometry of the underground network are viewed together with a specific, evidence-supported central target. They create a picture of deliberate defensive engineering built around one particular point. The investigation has always had evidence that the underground system was deliberately designed. What has changed is that the team now has its strongest evidence-based proposal, yet for what that design may have been intended to protect. Looking back at the historical records with this specific location in mind also creates new connections. When a newly confirmed finding changes the way older accounts are interpreted, details that once seemed isolated can suddenly become more meaningful. Investigators who worked on Oak Island over more than 2 centuries recorded unusual features and anomalies in and around this general area. Some of those observations were considered significant at the time, but they were eventually set aside because investigators did not have the tools or broader framework needed to understand what they were seeing. Those early accounts may have been describing something that was genuinely present beneath the island. The data framework developed during this season is the first one that appears specific enough to give those older observations a clearer context. Signals and unusual findings have been associated with this area since the earliest documented investigations. What is different now is that the investigation has reached a level of data quality that allows the team to identify where those signals may be leading. However, there is an important distinction between identifying a location through evidence and physically confirming what is actually there. That gap is real, and it needs to be acknowledged honestly. The underground conditions in the identified area are extremely challenging. Reaching the depth suggested by the data would require working in ground where water management risks are a serious concern, particularly given how the flood tunnel system has behaved when disturbed at depth. Before any major drilling or excavation can begin, the structural conditions of the area will need to be carefully assessed. That assessment is not optional. It is a necessary step if the team wants to investigate the target without damaging or destroying the very feature they are trying to reach. The expertise required for this kind of assessment is highly specialized, and carrying out the work properly will take time. But none of these challenges changes what the current evidence indicates. They simply define what will be required to test the conclusion safely and properly. The practical difference between having a probable zone and having a specific evidence-supported target is significant. Before this episode, the investigation had to divide its attention and resources among several possible areas. Each one represented a reasonable candidate for further investigation. Now, with a specific location identified by the team's most cautious and analytical voice, those resources can be focused on one particular point rather than spread across a range of possibilities. That changes the nature of the investigation. The next phase is no longer simply a search. It is an approach, and for anyone who has followed the Oak Island investigation across all these seasons, there is a major difference between those two things. The potential importance of physically confirming this location could also extend far beyond the television investigation itself. If the underground system on Oak Island was intentionally constructed, then the people who built it, their purpose, and what they were trying to protect have remained some of the biggest unanswered questions since the investigation began. Confirming the location of the system's most heavily protected zone would not automatically reveal who built it or why, but it would provide historical and archaeological researchers with something they have never had before: a specific physical location around which the investigation could be organized. Instead of researching a theory or a hypothetical area, researchers would have a confirmed point on the island connected directly to the underground system they have been studying for generations. That would fundamentally change the type of historical research that could be conducted. The next steps are therefore becoming much more specific. Additional radar surveys and carefully targeted drilling can focus directly on the identified zone and work toward physical confirmation. Experts can conduct a detailed structural assessment of the underground conditions at the relevant depth. Historical researchers can also revisit existing records with this newly identified location as their reference point, potentially uncovering connections that were difficult to recognize before. At the same time, outside specialists can be consulted to determine exactly what the underground conditions in this particular area require for an investigation that is both safe and effective. The evidence has brought the investigation to a specific point. Now the challenge is to determine what is actually waiting beneath it. Each of these steps follows directly from the identification that has now been made. Every one of them is necessary before the confirmation work can move forward properly, and all of them will begin from the most specific and evidence-supported starting point the investigation has ever had. After more than 2 centuries of asking the same question of the same island, the investigation now has its clearest and most evidence-supported proposal, yet for where the answer may be located. The question, however, remains open. The investigation is not over, and physical confirmation has not yet been achieved. But the position from which the team is approaching the mystery has changed in a way that cannot simply be undone. That change is not based on increased excitement or optimism. It is based on the data. Marty Lagina pointed to a specific location, and the evidence provided the basis for his conclusion. What lies at that location is ultimately what the Oak Island mystery has always been about. And for the first time in the history of this investigation, after all the years of searching, the team knows specifically where to go to look for the answer.